CASON WALLACE looks like the next lottery pick out of Kentucky. This is Floor and Ceiling, let's break him down. At 6'4" with a 6'6" wingspan, Kentucky guard CASON WALLACE is one of the best two-way playmakers in the 2023 draft. On offense, let's start from 3, which in some ways is Wallace's swing skill. As a freshman, more than 4 in 10 of his shots came from deep. Wallace was solid, making a little under 35% of his trays on 4 attempts per game. CASON isn't really a gunner from the perimeter, but he's clearly comfortable out there. He gets into his shots on the hop, and his mechanics are nice and compact without too many moving pieces. Down the line, I trust that Wallace will be able to make open threes when he receives off drive and kicks, swing passes, or pick and rolls. Like we'll get into, I like him with the ball in his hands, but I do think that Wallace's game meshes really well with another playmaker, so making these off-ball trays is important. Wallace played with Sahvir Wheeler a bit at Kentucky, but Wheeler had a tough year, and he wasn't really the type of ball handler who could also create for his fellow guard. That's why also looking towards the future, it is important to point out that Wallace is not much of a dynamic shooter. Like I said, he has clean mechanics on his makes, but the Kentucky guard is not yet ready to take more complicated threes off movement, off the dribble as we'll see, or in late shot clock situations. He's better suited to spot-ups or catch and shoots where he has a nice release, but he also has the time to gather himself and not get rushed. This applies to both his lower and upper body. That said, it is encouraging that he's willing to take these threes already. But the note is, they're not really going in yet. Importantly, I'm also going to be looking to check if Wallace can become more reliable off the dribble. Only 8 of his makes this season were unassisted. This is going to be key for him against switches, but also for when defenses go under on him. Right now, most do not mind letting the Kentucky guard shoot the ball. If CASON is to become more of an on-the-ball player, then any flashes like this become super valuable. Right now, one of Wallace's go-to shots is this floater. He's pretty effective attacking from 3 into these in-between areas. Clearly, this is translatable attacking closeouts, such as here. And Wallace should also be able to take advantage of situations where the defense is scrambling, but maybe he cannot get all the way to the rim. I like that CASON doesn't have to do a hard stop and then rise into his floater. He's getting into the shot in stride, hanging in the air, and off 1 or both feet. He's also able to get into this shot on both sides of the floor, but Wallace is still largely a right-handed finisher. However, it's not like he only attacks gaps. The Kentucky guard has shown some flashes of self-creation, and if former Kentucky guards are indicators, then I feel like Wallace has more to his game than we saw during his only season in Lexington. As we'll dive into, Wallace is fast and strong, but he's not particularly explosive or even big, so for him to have this type of craft and shiftiness is very important. I love this clip from the same game too. CASON is so paced, going right, stopping to change left, and then getting his defender in the air with the up and under to finish. Really, it's a combination of Wallace's touch from in between and his jumpers from 2-point range that give me the most hope for his 3 and overall his shot long term. Wallace took more 3s than anything else, but 2-point J's followed closely behind. He shot 110 of those and converted on a very good 40%. Virtually all of these makes were unassisted. Again, we see some signs of CASON's craft here, such as with this up fake to let the defender fly by before Wallace pulls up into his shot. His jumper is nice and tight, even if his gather can still be cleaned up sometimes, but Wallace's release point is high over his head, and he can pull the trigger with ease from around the elbows out of pick and rolls. Really, I feel like Wallace's self-creation doesn't have to be crazy. He's more stocky than fluid, so a few 2 or 3 dribble moves should do the trick, along with then some counters to take advantage of the additional spacing that he's gonna get. Already, CASON shows promise when he comes out of screens because he's able to freeze the big before making a move. And like with his floater, I also like that Wallace is able to take pick and roll reps on both sides of the floor. However, Wallace still has room to grow at the rim. Being slightly too reliant on his floater is part of it. Wallace is a good athlete in some ways, but he's not going to stand out for his burst or explosiveness. He's only okay in those areas, so he doesn't always get right to the rim. Wallace's numbers at the basket this year were fine. The 19-year-old made 68% of his shots there and created just about all of them for himself, but Wallace only took 75 attempts at the basket. That's relatively low for a guard, especially one as physical as he is. His volume from the free throw line was also too low, with only 70 free throws for the season. At this stage, I find Wallace to be at his best when he's a straight line driver. Anything that involves tight spaces or crowds still has room for growth. NBA spacing is going to help, but only to an extent if he's not being more assertive and playing above the rim. Looking ahead, he's also going to have to keep improving his left hand, which still needs more comfort. Maybe though I'm being slightly nitpicky, my main takeaway is increasing the volume really. Through that, I think you can probably offset everything else, especially since Wallace also has the floater in his bag. Because even if he does need to pick these scoop finishes better, they are useful in the right time and place. Once he gets more spacing and given his physicality, I think Wallace will get by fine on his drives most of the time. I don't know that he's a great athlete, but he's a good coordinated one, and he shouldn't struggle in that department. Also, Oscar Tshiebwe occupied a lot of space in the paint for Kentucky. Without him on the inside, even Wallace's process at the next level should look somewhat different. The geometry of the court is not going to be the same, so it's me having trust in his tools to pan out. Going back to what I was saying about Wallace's threes, his self-creation overall is just fairly limited right now. In general, I feel like CASON approaches things creatively on the floor, but I don't see him as a guard who's going to be chaining a bunch of moves together to break down his defender. There's nothing wrong with that in the right situation, but it does limit his offensive ceiling. Wallace is more physical than explosive, and he's still dependent on being given a straight line. Don't get me wrong, his base from 3, flashes from 2, and floater make CASON relatively safe on this end, but all of those still need more diversity. I'd love to see him convert on these types of jumpers more often. If Wallace grows as a shooter out of handoffs and such, you can then run more actions with him, and he also has that hezzy to get to the rim instead of shooting. Getting into his passing, I feel optimistic, but I don't think we've seen enough just yet. For instance, a lot of Wallace's best material at Kentucky came in transition. Sure, his physical gifts lend themselves to the open court, and again, he's better when given a runway instead of compact spaces, but a lot of this was contextual too. Kentucky's half-court spacing could be pretty rough, so they were better off getting running in transition, and also, Kentucky had the ball in Sahvir Wheeler's hands a lot more than in Wallace's, especially early in the season. That means that the sample size with Wallace purely as his team's point is small, but the signs were good. He had 136 assists to 60 turnovers this season, averaging a bit over 4 dishes per game. When he was on the floor, he assisted on almost 1/4 of Kentucky's makes. What I like most about CASON's playmaking is that it's scalable. He's shown glimpses of being able to get in the paint and then make the right read. I like that this comes attacking closeouts or off a live dribble. The fact that Wallace can execute those harder reads already makes me feel good, since it's what I'm seeing guards do in the NBA. You'll see this in the league, for example, with Wallace getting the pin down in the corner here and then disguising the floater into the lob pass. Speaking of the NBA, guards in the league run a lot of pick and rolls, and I thought Wallace fared off nicely in these situations in college. There's a lot to like here, such as Wallace's steady pace, then he's able to change speeds while keeping both defenders in the pick and roll engaged. One of the passes that he's great at is going one way, freezing and turning, and then tossing the assist to the dive man. He's able to execute these pocket passes with awesome precision against cramped college teams, so I feel like Wallace will have an even easier time once the lanes open up at the next level. Already now, he's able to meet his teammates both when they slip all the way to the rack, as well as on the short roll. But again, the key here for me will be to keep growing Wallace's range. We usually say this about shooting, but I think it applies to passes too. Wallace's reads are good or at least fine, but he can be sort of predictable if he's on your scouting report. For instance, CASON can still struggle when multiple bodies crowd him on his drives or after his first dribble. It's in those circumstances where Wallace has room to improve his vision and handle. Because even though I don't take issues with the passes that he's trying to make, he can still get rushed and then misjudge the weight or accuracy of his read. CASON Wallace is among the best defensive guards in the 2023 NBA draft. He's a disruptor on this end of the floor who always makes himself felt. CASON's 6'6" wingspan is only okay, so really it's more about how he sees the floor. Wallace times himself to near perfection. He's one of those guys who you feel is always first to loose balls, but clearly there's a reason why. The Kentucky guard averaged 2 steals per game, which is great. All of his advanced metrics here are also very encouraging. And even when CASON didn't outright snatch the ball from his opponent, Wallace is the type to rack up deflections and force ball handlers to pass the ball off. In other words, the stat sheet doesn't always reflect his impact, but the tape always does it justice. Wallace is a flat-out pitbull who I predict being really dangerous guarding at the point of attack. Because of his size, I'm not entirely sure how switchable he's going to be. He always competes, but I do think he's going to have to stick to guards and maybe check smaller wings here and there. Despite that, he can make a difference all over the floor though. We see that here as CASON helps on a great shooter in Jet Howard, then recovers back to his original man, and it's a great closeout under control to then wall off the drive with his chest. Or versus Arkansas, it's somewhat similar. Wallace is on Anthony Black at the top of the possession, but he's not a shooter, so CASON knows that he can sag off. That's how he's able to disrupt the roll man on one side of the floor before scrambling all the way back over the screen to close out. This capacity to cover ground also comes into play with CASON's blocks. He had 15 rejections in 32 games as a guard, which isn't particularly remarkable, but he does show promise, especially when it's paired up with the in-game footage. What I take away is how great Wallace is at moving in space. He's matching his attacker's strides, getting in a stance, and using his anticipation to time and secure blocks. These tools are great, so I wonder if down the line we might see some flashes of him protecting the rim. Wallace has the means to be a factor if he's making the right rotations, but as of now, most of his blocks are going to come when he's sliding with his defender. Of interest, I thought Alabama and Texas A&M had success putting CASON in the pick and roll. Down the line, I think he's going to be fine here, but there's obviously an adjustment curve that becomes bigger in the NBA for guards. Personally, I just thought Wallace was getting caught on screens far too easily. Like here, Kentucky gives up the switch even though they don't really need to, and it ends up in the and one. Wallace generally is very physical, but I do think he's going to have to keep adding strength to his frame so that he can defend against contact more easily. However, that's very fixable, so really for me, CASON projects as a great defender, somebody who you can depend on to stay in front of his man and make life hell for him. You probably want his actual output in terms of steals and blocks to go up a bit, but that's going to come in time if he keeps doing stuff like this. Watch how tough Wallace plays the big on the front, gets the steal, and then sets up the 3 in transition. At his best, he's a do-it-all guard. Out of Kentucky, CASON Wallace is one of the best two-way playmakers in this draft. I think right now I have him as a lottery pick, but what I want to see from him going forward is just diversifying everything. His finishing, his shooting, which I think is going to come around from the outside, his volume is nice and his 2-point numbers are great indicators, and then his playmaking as well. As always, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, make sure to leave a comment telling me what you think of CASON Wallace, and as always, if you enjoy the channel, make sure to subscribe. Take care, and I'll catch you guys next time.